Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The historical, social, and legal analysis presented throughout this video series is intended strictly for educational and entertainment purposes. It does not constitute formal legal counsel, marital therapy, or professional advice of any kind. Family laws, societal norms, and judicial precedents vary immensely across different time periods, states, and jurisdictions. Viewers are strongly encouraged to conduct their own independent due diligence or consult with a licensed professional regarding any specific legal or personal matters. In the year 1960, if you found yourself trapped in an American marriage defined by emotional abuse, profound incompatibility, or a quiet, suffocating misery, the legal system offered you a terrifyingly narrow path to freedom. American culture at the dawn of that decade did not recognize the concept of falling out of love. To sever a marital bond, the state demanded a villain and a victim. You had to prove in a public court of law that your spouse had committed an egregious statutory offense, such as physical cruelty, permanent desertion, or adultery. If you could not produce concrete, undeniable evidence of these specific legal faults, the law dictated that you must remain legally bound to your spouse until death. This rigid framework created an underbelly of desperation, forcing thousands of ordinary American citizens into a subterranean world of elaborate deception, fabricated scandals, and systemic perjury, just to escape their domestic situations. Consider the extreme legal reality of states like New York during the early part of the decade, where the sole ground for obtaining a divorce was proven adultery. This strict statutory limitation gave rise to a bizarre, highly organized industry of staged infidelity. Husbands and wives who mutually agreed that their marriage was over would collude with private investigators and professional photographers to manufacture evidence. A husband would hire an operative or a woman known as a correspondent to accompany him to a hotel room. They would undress down to their robes or undergarments, wait for a prearranged knock on the door, and allow a hired photographer to burst into the room to snap flashbulb pictures of the staged scene. These manufactured photographs, dripping with artificial shame, were then presented to a judge as absolute proof of marital betrayal. The courtrooms of America routinely accepted these orchestrated setups, participating in a collective cultural hypocrisy where judges, clerks, and attorneys knew the evidence was completely fraudulent. Yet all played along because the alternative was forcing citizens into lifelong legal confinement. The legal hurdles became even more punitive when a doctrine known as recrimination was applied to a case. Under this legal principle, if a husband accused his wife of cruelty, but the wife could prove that the husband had also committed a marital fault, the judge would rule that both parties were guilty. The potential outcome of this ruling was not a mutual release, but rather a complete denial of the divorce. The law essentially penalized mutual unhappiness, decreeing that if both spouses were terrible to each other, they deserved to be punished by staying married forever. For those who could not stomach the public humiliation of a staged courtroom trial or the threat of recrimination, the only viable alternative was the migratory divorce. This reality fueled the famous Reno cure. Wealthy citizens would abandon their homes in major metropolitan centers like New York or Chicago and travel to Nevada, where residency could be established in just 6 weeks. This loophole created a massive economy of dude ranches, specialized boarding houses, and quick-access law firms catered entirely to Americans waiting out their 6-week sentences in the desert just to obtain a clean break. This creates a profound historical paradox that we must untangle. How did a nation that was completely obsessed with the idealized nuclear family of the 1950s, a society that viewed the suburban home with its manicured lawn as the ultimate shield against global instability, suddenly pivot into a decade that completely dismantled the traditional marriage contract? By analyzing historical trends, we see that the 1960s became a cultural pressure cooker, where the rigid expectations of the past collided violently with an emerging desire for individual autonomy. The divorce rate, which had remained relatively stable at the beginning of the century, began a dramatic, unprecedented climb that would forever alter the demographic landscape of the United States. This 10-part deep dive masterclass is an exhaustive analysis of that precise journey. We are going to look beyond the surface-level nostalgia of the 60s to examine the raw legal battles, the shifting economic structures, and the profound psychological transformations that shifted divorce from a rare, career-ending scandal into a mainstream cultural reality. For the modern American audience, understanding this pivotal historical shift solves a critical ongoing problem: the profound lack of context surrounding why contemporary relationships, marriage structures, and dating dynamics feel so deeply complicated, high stakes, and fragile today. We currently live in a culture that prioritizes personal fulfillment, emotional compatibility, and the absolute freedom to leave a relationship that no longer serves our psychological growth. However, this modern freedom did not emerge from a vacuum. The anxieties, the legal battles over assets and custody, the shifting expectations we place on our partners, and even the systemic fear of commitment that plagues modern generations are the direct genetic descendants of the 1960s divorce revolution. By looking closely at the case studies of this transformative decade, you will gain a diagnostic roadmap to understand your own relational patterns and the institutional forces that continue to shape your personal life. Throughout this comprehensive series, we will examine the multi-layered mechanics of this transition. We will investigate how the rise of second-wave feminism and the increased entry of women into the workforce provided the economic independence necessary for wives to walk away from toxic marriages, shattering the financial dependency that had historically kept them trapped. In the early 1960s, a woman often could not even open a bank account or secure a credit card without her husband's signature, making the decision to seek a divorce an act of immediate economic suicide. We will track how those financial barriers began to erode, changing the power dynamics of the American household forever. We will analyze the introduction of revolutionary legislative changes, leading up to the monumental signing of the Family Law Act of 1969 by California Governor Ronald Reagan, which established the nation's first true no-fault divorce system. We will dissect how popular media, literature, and Hollywood films began to reframe the narrative of the divorced individual, moving away from portraying them as broken failures, social pariahs, or corporate liabilities, and instead casting them as courageous pioneers pursuing authenticity and self-actualization. Furthermore, this masterclass will confront the complex, multi-generational consequences of this cultural shift. We will evaluate the historical trends regarding how the legal system adapted to the sudden influx of custody battles, the evolution of alimony, and the psychological impact on the first major generation of children raised in split households. This is not a superficial overview designed to give you quick historical trivia. This is an objective, deeply researched analysis constructed to provide absolute clarity on how the American family model was rewritten from the ground up. By evaluating these past shifts, you will be equipped with the historical literacy needed to navigate modern discussions around commitment, legal protections, and the evolving definition of family in the 21st century. Let us begin this journey by stepping backward into the year 1960, looking at the exact structural fault lines that were about to fracture the foundations of American society. To truly comprehend the magnitude of the shift that was about to occur, we must look at the structural reality of an average American household in the year 1960. Imagine a couple named John and Mary Higgins, living in a newly developed suburban community just outside of Chicago. From the outside, their life matches the exact blueprint of the post-World War II American dream. John commutes to a corporate job in the city, wearing his tailored suit, while Mary manages a pristine, appliance-filled kitchen and cares for their 3 children. This structure was not merely a lifestyle choice, it was treated as a civic duty. The Cold War was at its peak, and American cultural institutions actively weaponized the stable, consumer-rich nuclear family as definitive proof of Western superiority. To deviate from this norm was to be seen as fundamentally unstable, unpredictable, and a threat to the neighborhood social fabric. But inside this suburban home, the reality is far more bleak. John and Mary have experienced a complete breakdown of emotional and physical intimacy over the course of 5 years. There is no physical violence, no public scandal, and no infidelity. Instead, there is a suffocating silent hostility that erodes their mental health daily. In the context of 2026, a couple experiencing this level of profound incompatibility would seek counseling, realize the relationship has run its course, and file for an amicable dissolution. But for John and Mary in 1960, the legal and social architecture of the United States makes a clean break nearly impossible. Let us trace the exact step-by-step process John and Mary would have to navigate if they decided to pursue a separation under the laws of that era. First, they would discover that American family law does not recognize mutual consent as a valid reason for ending a marriage. The state views marriage as a permanent contract between the husband, the wife, and the government. Because the state has an interest in maintaining social stability and preventing the financial burden of broken families from falling on public resources, it actively bars couples from simply agreeing to part ways. If John and Mary were to walk into a judge's chambers and state that they simply no longer love each other, the judge would immediately dismiss the case and potentially penalize them for collusion, which was viewed as an attempt to defraud the court. To move forward, one of them must legally sue the other. This requires establishing a clear statutory fault. Mary must become the plaintiff, and John must become the defendant. In the state of Illinois in 1960, the permitted grounds for divorce are strictly defined: adultery, physical cruelty, habitual drunkenness for a space of 2 consecutive years, or willful desertion. Since John is a sober, nonviolent provider who stays at home, Mary has no real legal grounds. To manufacture a ground, they are forced to enter a dark, institutionalized underworld of legal fiction. This brings us to a compelling historical case study of how fault-based systems corrupted the legal infrastructure. John and Mary would have to hire an attorney who specializes in domestic relations. This attorney, operating within the standard practices of the era, would discreetly advise them to stage an act of cruelty or infidelity. If they choose the path of extreme cruelty, Mary would have to testify under oath that John struck her on at least 2 distinct occasions, leaving physical marks. They would need to recruit a close friend or family member to commit perjury by taking the stand and claiming they witnessed these non-existent acts of violence, or saw the resulting bruises. The psychological toll of this process cannot be overstated. Mary is forced to falsely brand her husband a domestic abuser in a public record, and John must accept this stigma, which could instantly destroy his career, as companies in 1960 routinely passed over divorced men for promotion, viewing them as unstable liabilities. If they choose the path of adultery instead, the process becomes an expensive, highly coordinated theater production. They must hire a private detective agency. John will agree to be caught in a compromising position at a local motel with a hired woman who works with the detective agency. The detective will track John to the motel, wait outside for a specified amount of time, and then burst into the room with a photographer to capture images of John alongside the hired correspondent. These photographs are then entered into the official court record as uncontestable proof of John's moral failing. Historical trends show that during the late 1950s and early 1960s, thousands of these staged divorces occurred across major American cities every single year. The judiciary was fully aware of this widespread fabrication, yet judges routinely looked the other way because the statutory framework gave them no other mechanism to resolve broken marriages. Now let us examine the profound economic barrier that kept women trapped in these unions, independent of the legal theater. Imagine if Mary decided she could no longer participate in this web of lies, and wanted to leave John without a formal divorce. In 1960, her economic mobility was virtually non-existent. A married woman could not easily secure a credit card in her own name. Banks routinely required the signature of a husband or a male relative to approve any line of credit or loan. If Mary attempted to rent an apartment on her own, landlords were legally permitted, and socially encouraged, to refuse to lease to a single or separated woman, viewing them as high-risk tenants without a male guarantor. Furthermore, the job market was starkly segregated. Help-wanted advertisements in major newspapers were explicitly divided into separate sections for men and women. The positions available to women were overwhelmingly restricted to low-paying secretarial, retail, or domestic roles. A woman entering the workforce in 1960 earned roughly 60 cents for every dollar earned by a man in an equivalent position, and there were zero legal protections against harassment or sudden termination. For a mother like Mary with 3 children, walking away from John meant stepping directly into immediate, severe financial vulnerability. The financial structure of the era functioned as a highly effective cage, ensuring that economic dependency enforced marital longevity. This structural rigidity created a massive reservoir of psychological distress across the United States. While the cultural narrative of 1960 celebrated the happy homemaker, historical trends reveal a sharp spike in the prescription of early tranquilizers to suburban women. These medications were explicitly marketed by pharmaceutical companies to physicians as a tool to help anxious, unfulfilled wives adapt to the confines of their domestic roles. Rather than addressing the root cause of marital unhappiness or structural confinement, the society of 1960 sought to chemically medicate women into compliance to preserve the illusion of the perfect nuclear family. For the men, the system was equally punishing in different ways. A husband who was sued for divorce under the fault system faced devastating financial and social outcomes. Because he was labeled the guilty party in the eyes of the law, judges routinely used alimony and property division as a form of judicial punishment. John could find himself ordered to pay a massive percentage of his weekly earnings to Mary for the rest of her life, while completely losing access to his children, as custody was almost universally awarded to the mother unless she was proven to be morally unfit. The stakes were incredibly high, turning every genuine legal divorce into an all-out war of mutual destruction. These are the exact structural fault lines that characterized American society at the very beginning of the decade. The system was designed to be inflexible, punitive, and deeply public, operating on the belief that by making divorce as painful and humiliating as possible, citizens would be forced to maintain their marital bonds at all costs. But human behavior cannot be permanently suppressed by rigid statutes. Below the surface of this enforced stability, a massive cultural rebellion was quietly gathering strength. The economic, legal, and social pressures were building to a critical mass that the existing laws could no longer contain. In our next segment, we will explore how this pressure cooker finally exploded, as we analyze the emergence of an underground railroad for marital freedom. We will look at how ordinary Americans began to systematically bypass their local courts by exploiting international borders, creating a booming industry of instant Mexican divorces that forced the United States courts to intervene. We will examine how a single explosive book published in 1963 gave a voice to millions of silently suffering women, completely shattering the myth of suburban bliss and turning the private misery of the American housewife into a public political movement. The battle lines were being drawn, and the traditional American marriage was about to face its greatest institutional challenge. Stay tuned for Part 3, where we dissect the legal loopholes and cultural catalysts that triggered the ultimate collapse of the fault-based system. As we cross into the middle of the 1960s, the severe restrictions of the fault-based divorce system began to generate a widespread systemic defiance that bypassed American courtrooms entirely. Ordinary citizens who possessed the financial means refused to allow archaic local statutes to dominate their personal destinies. This defiance manifested in the dramatic rise of an international legal loophole centered in the Mexican state of Chihuahua, particularly in the border city of Ciudad Juarez. While Nevada required a 6-week residency period, Mexican authorities recognized an extraordinary opportunity to generate substantial economic revenue by catering to unhappy Americans. They established a system that required no extended residency whatsoever. It became known as the quickie or bilateral Mexican divorce, and it quickly turned into a multi-million-dollar industry that fundamentally undermined the authority of United States domestic law. To understand how this cross-border legal mechanism functioned, consider a case study involving a successful New York corporate executive named Robert Vance in the year 1964. Robert and his wife had reached a point of absolute emotional alienation. They both wanted an end to their marriage, but under New York law at the time, the only acceptable ground was adultery. Robert could not afford to stage a fraudulent hotel room raid. His corporate clients would immediately cut ties with his firm if his name appeared in local newspapers, attached to a public sex scandal. The fault-based system left him with no viable domestic options. Instead, Robert engaged the services of a specialized broker in Manhattan, who coordinated with Mexican legal counsel. The step-by-step process was remarkably efficient. Robert boarded a flight to El Paso, Texas, walked across the International Bridge into Ciudad Juarez, and presented himself at the local municipal court. He signed an official registry book, thereby establishing a technical, momentary presence under Mexican jurisdiction. Meanwhile, back in New York, his wife signed a power of attorney document explicitly stating that she submitted to the jurisdiction of the Chihuahua court and did not contest the dissolution. A Mexican attorney represented her in the courtroom. Within less than 24 hours, a Mexican judge signed a formal decree dissolving the marriage. Robert flew back to New York the following day, holding a piece of paper that declared him a single man. However, this international alternative introduced a chaotic layer of legal instability back home. The potential outcomes of a Mexican divorce depended entirely on which state you resided in. While some state courts, such as those in New York, eventually recognized these bilateral foreign decrees under the principle of comity to prevent total social chaos, other states rejected them completely. Imagine if Robert tried to remarry in a state that deemed his Mexican decree invalid. In the eyes of that local government, his new marriage was a criminal act of bigamy. His original marriage remained active, and any property he acquired with his new partner could be claimed by his first wife. This geographic inconsistency created a massive class divide. Wealthy Americans could navigate these international loopholes and absorb the legal risks, while working-class citizens remained entirely locked out, trapped in broken homes because they could not afford a ticket to El Paso or Reno. While these legal fractures were widening, an intellectual catalyst emerged that completely transformed the internal psychology of the American household. In February 1963, An investigative journalist and mother named Betty Friedan published a book that would fundamentally reshape historical trends regarding American family structures. The feminine mystique detonated like a bomb in the middle of suburban culture. Friedan identified a pervasive, quiet desperation afflicting millions of women across the country, a condition she famously termed the problem that has no name. For more than a decade, the dominant cultural narrative insisted that fulfillment for an American woman was found exclusively in the roles of wife, mother, and homemaker. Women who felt a deep sense of emptiness, chronic anxiety, or depression while looking at their clean kitchens and healthy children were told by medical professionals that they were suffering from a personal psychological defect. They were diagnosed with a lack of feminine maturity and were routinely prescribed heavy doses of tranquilizers to suppress their discontent. Friedan's case studies shattered this narrative by proving that this unhappiness was not an individual illness, but a systemic response to a political and economic architecture that forced women to completely surrender their independent identity upon entering a marriage. When women across the United States read Friedan's analysis, it triggered a massive collective cognitive shift. For the first time, millions of wives realized that their marital dissatisfaction was not a moral failure or a personal sin. This realization altered the moral calculus of endurance. Historically, a woman was expected to sacrifice her personal happiness to maintain the stability of the home, a sacrifice viewed as a supreme virtue. But as the insights of the early feminist movement spread, the act of staying in a cold, unfulfilling, or restrictive marriage began to be reevaluated. It was increasingly viewed not as a virtue, but as a form of psychological self-destruction that erased a woman's humanity. This psychological awakening directly influenced historical trends in marital dissolution. Wives were no longer willing to wait for their husbands to commit a legal fault like adultery or physical abuse to justify leaving. They began demanding the right to exit a marriage simply because the relationship prevented their growth as individual human beings. The traditional concept of marriage as a permanent economic and social alliance was being replaced by a modern expectation of emotional and intellectual companionship. If that companionship died, the marriage was seen as dead, regardless of what the legal statutes declared. By 1965, the American judicial system was facing a crisis of compliance and legitimacy. The combination of thousands of citizens utilizing Mexican and Nevadan loopholes, alongside a profound cultural shift in female consciousness, placed an unsustainable strain on domestic courts. Every single day, judges were forced to preside over bitter, adversarial trials where it was completely obvious that both parties were lying under oath, fabricating evidence, and manipulating the system just to achieve a basic civil resolution. The law was out of step with the actual lived reality of the population. This institutional strain reached a critical tipping point where prominent legal scholars, matrimonial attorneys, and even religious organizations began to acknowledge that the fault-based system was actively corrupting the integrity of the American legal system itself. The law, which was supposed to protect morality, was forcing honest citizens to become liars and perjurers. The pressure for a total structural overhaul was becoming irresistible. This brings us to a monumental turning point in our journey. How did a legal system that had spent over a century fiercely guarding the permanence of marriage suddenly collapse and give way to a radical new doctrine that allowed a marriage to be ended by simple mutual consent? In our next segment, we will dive deep into the state that became the epicenter of this legal revolution, California. We will trace the step-by-step political battle that led an unexpected conservative icon to sign the most progressive family legislation in American history, a move that would permanently alter the legal landscape of the entire nation. We will explore the hidden political deals, the intense opposition from traditionalist groups, and the immediate explosive surge in filings that followed. Stay tuned for Part 4, where the legal walls finally come tumbling down. The legal walls did not just crack. They were entirely demolished by a legislative earthquake centered in California. To understand how this profound transformation occurred, we must examine the year 1966, when the governor of California, Edmund G. Brown, established the Governor's Commission on the Family. This was an unprecedented bipartisan coalition consisting of leading judges, law professors, attorneys, and behavioral scientists. They were tasked with a singular monumental mission: to study the systemic corruption embedded within the fault-based divorce courts and propose a total structural overhaul of the state's domestic relations laws. The commission eventually released a scathing, detailed report revealing that the existing adversarial system was actively escalating hostility between parents, causing severe psychological harm to children, draining family resources through prolonged litigation, and forcing otherwise honest citizens into routine perjury just to escape dead marriages. By the time the Commission's revolutionary recommendations wound their way through the complex legislative pipeline, a new governor had taken office in Sacramento, Ronald Reagan. This introduction of Reagan into the narrative presents a fascinating historical irony. Reagan was a staunch political conservative who routinely championed traditional family values, individual responsibility, and the preservation of foundational American institutions. Yet, he held a unique, deeply personal connection to this specific issue. Reagan was himself a divorced man, having finalized a painful, highly publicized separation from actress Jane Wyman in 1949 under the old adversarial framework. He knew firsthand the intense public scrutiny, the emotional bruising, and the legal gymnastics required to end a marriage when the state demanded the assignment of explicit blame. The true legislative engine behind this transformation was a California assemblyman named James A. Hayes, a Republican from Long Beach. Hayes took the core findings of the governor's commission and drafted a piece of legislation that would completely eliminate the concept of marital fault from the legal lexicon. This bill, which would become known as the Family Law Act of 1969, proposed a radical, unprecedented concept. A marriage could be dissolved simply because it had broken down irretrievably, without either party being designated as the perpetrator or the victim. Traditionalist groups, including prominent religious organizations, launched intense opposition, arguing that removing fault would destroy the sanctity of marriage, encourage casual abandonment, and cause the complete collapse of social order. Despite this fierce resistance, the bill passed through the legislature as modernizing forces argued that the law must reflect the actual behavior of the population. Imagine a new scenario involving a couple named David and Linda Miller living in Los Angeles in January of 1970, the exact month the Family Law Act officially went into effect. If David and Linda had attempted to separate just 1 month prior, they would have been forced to engage in the hostile, expensive legal theater of proving adultery or fabricating physical cruelty. But under the new law, the entire step-by-step process of ending their marriage is completely rewritten, shifting from a quasi-criminal trial into an administrative dissolution. First, the legal terminology itself changes to strip away the adversarial nature of the proceedings. David no longer files a lawsuit against Linda. Instead, he files a neutral document called a petition for dissolution of marriage. Linda is no longer labeled the defendant. She is designated as the respondent. The official title of the court case changes from David Miller versus Linda Miller to In Re the Marriage of Miller. This semantic shift is crucial because it removes the structural assumption that one party is suing the other for damages or wrongdoing. Next, David does not need to hire private investigators to track Linda, nor does he need to bribe acquaintances to commit perjury on the witness stand. Instead, the petition lists a singular ground for the dissolution: irreconcilable differences which have caused the irremediable breakdown of the marriage. When David takes the stand in a California courtroom, the judge does not ask for salacious details, secret photographs, or confessions of betrayal. The judge simply confirms that these differences exist and asks if there is any temporary counseling or modification that could save the union. If David states under oath that the marriage is entirely dead, the court accepts this as an objective legal fact. For the first time in American history, unilateral divorce becomes a functional reality. If one partner wants out of the marriage, the relationship is legally over, and the other partner no longer possesses the statutory power to block the exit. This legal shift fundamentally altered the mechanics of asset division and alimony, moving the system away from moral judgment and toward mathematical calculation. Under the old fault system, if a husband was found guilty of extreme cruelty or adultery, the judge possessed the discretionary power to strip him of his assets and award a massive, permanent alimony package to the wife as a form of financial punishment. Conversely, if a wife was found guilty of infidelity, she could be left completely destitute, losing all access to the family wealth. The Family Law Act of 1969 completely dismantled this punitive framework by introducing the concept of community property division, based on absolute equality, completely divorced from moral culpability. Assets acquired during the marriage were to be split exactly 50-50, regardless of who initiated the separation or who was perceived as the bad partner. Alimony, now formally referred to as spousal support, was shifted from a permanent lifetime pension into a temporary financial bridge designed to help the dependent spouse transition into the workforce and achieve self-sufficiency. The potential outcomes of this legislative shift were immediate and staggering. Historical trends show that as soon as the clock struck midnight on January 1, 1970, courthouses across the state of California were completely overwhelmed by an unprecedented wave of filings. Thousands of couples who had been living in separated, quiet misery for years, unable or unwilling to participate in the fraudulent theater of the old fault system, rushed to the courts to utilize the new no-fault mechanism. The divorce rate in California spiked exponentially within the first 12 months, signaling a massive release of pent-up social pressure that the old laws had artificially suppressed. Ronald Reagan signed the bill into law believing it would reduce the hypocrisy, blackmail, and perjury rampant in the courts. However, later in his life, as historical trends revealed the massive widespread destabilization of the traditional nuclear family structure across the nation, Reagan would openly state that signing the Family Law Act of 1969 was one of the single greatest political regrets of his public career. Despite his subsequent doubts, the California model created an unstoppable domino effect. Legal systems across the United States watched California's experiment with intense fascination. Within a few short years, states like Iowa, Michigan, and New York began dismantling their own fault-based statutes, rushing to adopt their own variations of no-fault legislation to prevent their citizens from migrating to other states to end their marriages. While the removal of the fault system was celebrated as a massive victory for individual freedom, personal autonomy, and legal honesty, it rapidly triggered a series of severe, unexpected crises that no one in the California legislature had anticipated. The sudden shift to an equal 50-50 split of assets and the reduction of permanent alimony did not create a utopian landscape of gender equality. Instead, it plunged thousands of newly divorced women and their children into immediate, catastrophic financial vulnerability, creating a brand new socio-economic phenomenon that would shock the American public. In our next segment, we will analyze the dark, financial underbelly of the no-fault revolution. We will examine the case studies of women who found themselves suddenly cast out of the suburban dream with zero independent credit history, minimal professional work experience, and a legal system that mistook formal equality for actual economic fairness. Stay tuned for Part 5, where we expose the hidden financial cost of freedom and how the law accidentally created a new class of impoverished citizens. The immediate consequence of this legal revolution was a devastating economic blind spot that modern analysts look back on with profound concern. When states rushed to adopt no-fault statutes based on the California model, legislators operated under a flawed, idealistic assumption that legal equality automatically translated to economic equality. They believed that by creating a system of gender-neutral asset division and stripping away the moral judgments of the past, they were liberating both partners equally. But this blind spot completely ignored the deeply entrenched structural inequities of the 1960s American economy. Marriage, under the traditional mid-century model, was a specialized division of labor where the husband invested entirely in his career assets, while the wife invested entirely in the domestic infrastructure of the home. When a no-fault divorce dissolved that partnership, the legal system split the tangible, static assets down the middle, but left the most valuable asset of all, the husband's earning capacity, entirely in his possession. To see this systemic failure unfold in precise, step-by-step detail, imagine a scenario involving an ordinary American woman named Susan Montgomery in the year 1971. Susan had married her husband, Richard, in 1959. Over 12 years of marriage, Susan followed the exact cultural script prescribed by her society. She dropped out of college to support Richard while he completed his engineering degree, managed their suburban home, and raised their 3 children. During this entire period, Susan earned zero independent income, built zero savings, and accumulated zero professional experience. Meanwhile, Richard climbed the corporate ladder, established an extensive network of professional contacts, accumulated seniority, and built a substantial future pension. His earning potential had skyrocketed, funded directly by Susan's unpaid domestic labor, which freed him from all household and childcare responsibilities. When their marriage dissolved under the new no-fault framework, the court stepped in to enforce what it deemed a fair, equal division of property. The court looked at their primary tangible assets, the suburban home, a family station wagon, and a modest savings account containing $5,000. To satisfy the mandate of absolute equality, the court ordered that the family home be sold so that the equity could be divided evenly. Susan received $25,000 from the sale of the house, alongside $2,500 from the savings account. On paper, Susan was handed an equal share of the marital wealth. But look at the immediate practical outcomes of this distribution. Richard walked away from the marriage with his $25,000 of capital, but more importantly, he retained 100% of his career assets. His $30,000 a year salary remained completely intact, and his future corporate pension was largely protected under the early variations of the no-fault laws. Susan, on the other hand, walked away with $27,500 of liquid capital, 3 children to support, and an absolute earning capacity of 0. The legal system had mistaken formal equality for actual economic fairness, treating Susan as an independent, fully empowered economic actor the moment the divorce decree was signed, while ignoring the 12 years of systemic economic dependency that the marriage contract had enforced upon her. The next step in Susan's economic descent was the immediate encounter with severe credit and banking discrimination. With the family home sold, Susan needed to secure a place to live for herself and her children. When she applied to rent a modest apartment in a nearby suburb, the landlord requested her independent credit history and proof of employment. In 1971, Susan discovered a chilling structural barrier. Because all lines of credit, retail store accounts, and utility bills during her marriage had been held exclusively in Richard's name, Susan possessed no independent credit score. To the banking and financial institutions of the era, Susan was an economic ghost. Landlords routinely rejected her applications, viewing a divorced single mother with no employment history as an unacceptable, high-risk tenant. Even when Susan attempted to utilize her half of the property settlement to secure a small mortgage or buy a reliable used car, financial institutions routinely refused to grant her a loan without the signature of a male guarantor, such as her father or a male relative. The institutional architecture of the American financial system had not caught up to the reality of the no-fault divorce boom. It remained designed to lock women out of independent capital accumulation, ensuring that the immediate potential outcome of leaving a marriage was a rapid slide down the socio-economic ladder. Faced with dwindling cash reserves, Susan was forced to enter the highly segregated labor market of the early 1970s. Historical trends reveal that the employment options available to women returning to the workforce after years of domesticity were dismal. Susan found herself funneled directly into the pink-collar ghetto, a tier of the economy restricted to low-wage, non-unionized positions such as receptionists, retail clerks, and typists. Her skills from the late 1950s were largely obsolete, and she faced intense competition from a massive influx of other newly divorced women trying to survive in the exact same labor pool. Furthermore, the concept of equal pay for equal work was a distant ideal. Women entering the workforce in this era routinely earned a fraction of what men earned for comparable labor. Susan's entry-level clerical job paid her a meager $400 a month. This income was completely insufficient to cover the escalating costs of independent rent, groceries, utility bills, and the newly manufactured necessity of commercial childcare, which had previously been provided for free within the nuclear family structure. This financial crisis was severely exacerbated by the radical collapse of spousal support, or alimony. Under the old fault system, alimony was often awarded as a permanent, lifelong financial obligation levied against the guilty husband to maintain the innocent wife in the standard of living she had grown accustomed to. But the no-fault revolution introduced a major shift toward rehabilitative spousal support. Judges, embracing the new rhetoric of female liberation, began ruling that women should become self-sufficient as quickly as possible. Consequently, instead of permanent support, Susan was awarded spousal support for a strict, arbitrary duration of just 2 years. The court assumed that 2 years was an adequate window for a woman who had been out of the workforce for more than a decade to completely retrain herself, secure a career track job, and bridge the massive gender wage gap. When those 24 months expired, that financial lifeline vanished completely, regardless of whether Susan had achieved economic stability. The final fracture in this economic safety net was the total systemic failure of child support enforcement. The court ordered Richard to pay a designated monthly sum to assist with the upbringing of their 3 children. However, historical trends from the early 1970s show that child support orders were treated by the legal system as largely optional suggestions. There were no automated wage garnishments, no centralized state tracking databases, and no federal tax intercept programs to compel compliance. If Richard decided to skip a payment, move to a different state, or simply stop paying altogether, the entire burden of enforcement fell directly on Susan. She would have to hire a private attorney, pay expensive upfront retainer fees, and navigate a sluggish court system just to demand the money owed to her children. For millions of women in Susan's position, the cost of legally pursuing a non-compliant ex-husband exceeded the value of the support itself. Case studies from this era demonstrate that within 1 year of a divorce decree, more than half of all divorce fathers failed to comply fully with their child support obligations, leaving single mothers to bear the entire financial weight of child-rearing alone. This combination of equal property division, restricted spousal support, credit exclusion, and non-existent child support enforcement created a profound sociological phenomenon known as the feminization of poverty. Data compiled by researchers throughout the 1970s revealed a stark, terrifying divergence in the post-divorce standards of living between men and women. While divorced men experienced a substantial increase in their individual disposable income because their primary salary was no longer supporting a multi-person household, divorced women and their children experienced an immediate, average drop in their standard of living exceeding 70%. The no-fault revolution had successfully delivered legal freedom, but it had accidentally extracted a catastrophic financial price from the very women it claimed to liberate. As this new class of impoverished single mothers expanded across the American landscape, the public consciousness began to register the deep instability fracturing the suburban dream. The private financial suffering of these families could no longer be hidden behind closed doors. This widespread domestic disruption began to catch the eye of a powerful cultural force that would amplify, monetize, and reflect these anxieties back to the public: the American media machine. In our next segment, we will pivot from the brutal economics of the courtroom to the glamorous world of Madison Avenue and Hollywood. We will analyze how television executives, advertisers, and filmmakers suddenly realized that the rising demographic of the divorced American was an untapped goldmine. We will examine how iconic television sitcoms and groundbreaking films began to consciously rewrite the image of the divorcee, shifting them from tragic figures of societal failure into symbols of modern, independent consumption. Stay tuned for Part 6, where we explore how the entertainment industry capitalized on the breakdown of the American family and turned personal reinvention into a multi-billion-dollar marketing strategy. The media landscape of the United States did not merely observe the collapse of the traditional nuclear family. It actively commodified, reframed, and accelerated the phenomenon. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, television networks had functioned as the enforcement arm of traditional domesticity. Programs like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver presented a highly sanitized, unyielding vision of American life where marital conflict was non-existent and divorce was treated as an unspeakable social death. If a divorced character ever did appear in an early 1960s script, they were almost universally depicted as deeply flawed, untrustworthy, or tragic figures whose presence threatened the moral safety of the community. But as the actual divorce rate began its historic climb in the mid-1960s, a profound realization swept through the executive boardrooms of Hollywood and Madison Avenue. Media corporations realized that maintaining an idealized fiction was alienating a massive, rapidly expanding segment of the American population. A definitive case study of this corporate panic and subsequent cultural pivot occurred in 1970, during the development of the Mary Tyler Moore Show for CBS. The show's creators, James L. Brooks and Alan Burns, originally envisioned the main character, Mary Richards, as a 30-year-old woman who had recently undergone a divorce and was relocating to Minneapolis to start her life over. When the creators presented this concept to CBS network executives, it triggered an immediate institutional crisis. Historical trends show that the network conducted focus groups and research panels, concluding that the American public would refuse to sympathize with a divorced woman as a series lead. Executives explicitly stated that audiences would assume she had done something wrong to cause the breakdown of her marriage. The network forced the creators to completely rewrite the backstory, transforming Mary Richards into a woman who had simply ended a long-term engagement. Despite this initial corporate resistance, the cultural dam had already burst. Television networks quickly realized that themes of marital dissolution and personal reinvention generated massive viewer engagement and highly lucrative advertising revenue. By the time audiences tuned into networks in the early 1970s, shows like The Odd Couple presented divorce not as a localized tragedy, but as the foundational premise for mainstream comedy. Two divorced men navigating the realities of single adulthood in New York City became a rating juggernaut, proving that the American public was deeply eager to see the realities of their own fractured lives reflected back to them through the medium of entertainment. While television networks rewrote their programming scripts, advertising agencies on Madison Avenue underwent an even more radical transformation in how they profiled the American consumer. Imagine an advertising executive named Thomas Caldwell working at a premier agency in New York City. For his entire career, Thomas had designed campaigns based on a singular consumer unit, the suburban household consisting of a husband, a wife, and their children. He marketed large family-sized station wagons, bulk grocery packages, and single major appliances designed to serve a unified family for decades. But as Thomas analyzed the shifting demographic data, he recognized a massive financial opportunity. From a purely capitalistic perspective, a divorce does not destroy a consumer market, it doubles it. Instead of one household purchasing a single television, a single sofa, and a single set of kitchen appliances, a divorced couple suddenly requires two entirely separate living spaces. This economic multiplication meant that Thomas could now create distinct marketing campaigns targeting two newly manufactured demographics: the liberated single woman and the sophisticated bachelor. Madison Avenue began systematically dismantling the marketing materials of the past to exploit this double consumption model. For men, advertisers collaborated with publications like Playboy to popularize the concept of the bachelor pad. This new domestic space was marketed as a sanctuary of personal freedom, requiring specialized high-end consumer goods such as advanced stereophonic sound systems, modern minimalist furniture, and premium liquors. Divorce was repositioned not as a failure of male responsibility, but as a prestigious upgrade into a lifestyle of unbound consumerism and sexual autonomy. For women, the marketing shift was equally profound but tailored toward the rhetoric of self-actualization. Philip Morris launched its famous Virginia Slim cigarette campaign with the slogan, "You have come a long way, baby," explicitly linking corporate consumption with the political and social liberation of women from the confines of traditional marriage. Cosmetic companies, fashion houses, and convenience food manufacturers altered their messaging to target the independent, working single mother who needed to balance an active social life with the demands of a career. The potential outcomes of these campaigns were highly profitable, turning the personal trauma of marital dissolution into a multi-billion-dollar engine of economic growth. This theme of marital breakdown found its most raw, unvarnished expression in American cinema, which did not suffer from the same strict censorship restrictions as network television. A pivotal cinematic case study is the 1967 film Divorce American Style, starring Dick Van Dyke and Debbie Reynolds. The film functioned as a biting satirical deconstruction of the suburban dream, laying bare the absolute emotional exhaustion, financial manipulation, and legal absurdity embedded within the fault-based court system. This stood in stark, revolutionary contrast to films from earlier in the decade, such as the 1961 production of The Parent Trap, where the entire narrative trajectory was dedicated to children orchestrating elaborate schemes to force their separated parents back together to restore social stability. By 1967, Hollywood had stopped trying to fix the American marriage. Instead, filmmakers began celebrating the act of leaving it as an essential step toward achieving genuine human authenticity. The cumulative effect of this media saturation was the rapid, systemic normalization of divorce across the United States. When ordinary citizens saw their own private miseries, financial struggles, and desires for freedom played out on television screens, billboard advertisements, and movie theaters, the crushing weight of social stigma began to dissolve. Divorce shifted from being viewed as an exceptional, catastrophic moral failure into an expected, manageable stage of the modern human life cycle. Media did not just mirror the changing laws. It provided the cultural vocabulary that allowed millions of Americans to justify their departure from the traditional family model. However, as the media machine successfully glamorized the concepts of the bachelor pad and the liberated single woman, a profound and deeply troubling reality was unfolding away from the cameras. The entertainment industry deliberately ignored the most fragile and invisible participants in this cultural revolution: the children. While adults were busy exploring the frontiers of personal freedom and media executives were counting their advertising profits, an entire generation of American youth was being thrust into a completely unprecedented, legally chaotic social experiment. In our next segment, we will step behind the glamorous imagery of Madison Avenue to confront the raw psychological reality of the first major generation of children raised in the shadow of widespread divorce. We will examine how the American educational system, child psychology fields, and family courts scrambled to adapt to millions of split households. We will analyze the step-by-step evolution of the modern custody battle, the weaponization of children in the courtroom, and the long-term psychological impacts that would cross decades to shape the relational anxieties of adults. Stay tuned for Part 7, where we look directly into the eyes of the children of the revolution. The long-term psychological impacts that would cross decades to shape the relational anxieties of adults. Stay tuned for Part 7, where we look directly into the eyes of the children of the Revolution, as the legal and cultural machinery of the United States rapidly adapted to accommodate the soaring rates of marital dissolution. An entire generation of American children suddenly found themselves thrust into an unprecedented, completely unmapped psychological landscape. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the focus of the divorce conversation was almost entirely centered on adult liberation, female economic independence, and the elimination of courtroom hypocrisy. The prevailing cultural narrative, heavily influenced by early pop psychology, confidently asserted that children were inherently resilient creatures who would easily adapt to any domestic reconfiguration. It was frequently argued by family therapists of the era that a clean, decisive break from an unhappy household was far better for a child's development than exposure to the low-grade, chronic tension of an intact but incompatible marriage. However, this optimistic theory completely underestimated the profound institutional vacuum that existed regarding child welfare during this transition. To understand the raw, step-by-step reality of this domestic disruption, imagine a scenario involving a 10-year-old boy named Bobby Thompson, living in a suburban Ohio neighborhood in the year 1972. Bobby's parents had spent the previous 2 years navigating the gradual, agonizing erosion of their marriage. When they finally utilized the state's newly modernized laws to secure a dissolution, the impact on Bobby's daily existence was immediate, absolute, and deeply disorienting. For a child of that era, the structural collapse of the family unit did not begin with a sophisticated understanding of irreconcilable differences. It began with the sudden physical erasure of one parent from the domestic environment. One afternoon, Bobby watched his father pack 3 suitcases into the family sedan and drive away to a small, anonymous apartment complex located on the opposite side of the city. The legal infrastructure of 1972 family courts was completely unequipped to handle the complex emotional needs of children like Bobby. Under the old fault-based system, custody was treated primarily as a prize to be awarded to the innocent party or a penalty to be levied against the guilty. But with the rapid implementation of no-fault statutes, judges were forced to fall back on an archaic judicial presumption known as the tender years doctrine. This legal principle dictated that during their young, formative stages of development, children belonged exclusively under the direct care and custody of their mothers, unless the mother could be proven to be thoroughly unfit through extreme moral depravity or severe neglect. Consequently, the potential outcomes of this doctrine were deeply asymmetric. Fathers were systematically marginalized by the judicial system, transformed overnight from daily, active authority figures into weekend visitors. Bobby's relationship with his father was instantly reduced to a rigid, court-mandated schedule, precisely 2 weekends per month and alternating major holidays. This winner-take-all approach to custody rapidly turned children into the ultimate high-stakes leverage points in legal negotiations. Because the newly enacted laws required an equal division of tangible marital property, matrimonial attorneys quickly realized that while they could no longer litigate who caused the marriage to fail, they could aggressively weaponize the issue of child custody to secure financial advantages regarding child support payments and the retention of the family home. Parents who were otherwise decent individuals found themselves enticed by the adversarial nature of the legal system to engage in proxy wars through their children. Children like Bobby were subjected to intensive interrogations by court-appointed evaluators, forced to sit in the intimidating atmosphere of a judge's private chambers, and asked to express a preference between their mother and their father. This process inflicted severe, agonizing loyalty conflicts. A child could not express love or a desire to spend time with one parent without feeling an intense, crushing sense of betrayal toward the other. While these legal battles raged in the courtrooms, the public education system of the United States faced an immediate crisis of adaptation. Imagine Bobby walking into his 5th grade classroom in the autumn of 1972. The entire institutional architecture of the school was still completely aligned with the traditional 1950s nuclear family model. The textbooks featured illustrations of unified households, school registration forms strictly demanded the signatures of both a mother and a father residing at the same address, and standard classroom activities routinely required students to construct gifts for both parents or participate in parent-teacher conferences that assumed a unified front. Teachers and school administrators, lacking any formal training in childhood trauma or family transition, routinely misread the behavioral symptoms of these distressed students. When Bobby's academic performance plummeted, or when he exhibited sudden outbursts of regression, withdrawal, or intense anger, the educational system lacked the therapeutic resources to intervene constructively. Instead, society relied on a deeply damaging label that was applied indiscriminately to millions of youth during this decade. The product of a broken home. This phrase carried a heavy, pervasive social stigma. Neighbors, peers, and teachers viewed children from divorced families as fundamentally damaged, unstable, or predisposed to juvenile delinquency, further isolating these children at the precise moment they required profound community support. This massive, uncontrolled sociological experiment eventually forced the field of child psychology to confront the reality of the situation. Prior to the mid-1970s, there was almost zero long-term empirical data tracking the psychological trajectory of children of divorce. This scientific blind spot led to the launch of pioneering, multi-decade longitudinal studies, most notably the landmark historical trends analyzed by clinical psychologist Judith Wallerstein. Beginning her research in the early 1970s, Wallerstein tracked a specific cohort of children from divorcing families over a span of several decades. Her case studies completely dismantled the prevailing myth of effortless childhood resilience. Wallerstein's data revealed that while adults often experience the dissolution of a marriage as a necessary, liberating gateway to personal reinvention, their children experienced it as a foundational cataclysm that permanently shattered their baseline sense of global safety, predictability, and trust in adult institutions. The study demonstrated that the psychological fallout of divorce was not a brief, acute crisis that resolved itself within a year or two. Rather, it was a chronic, low-grade developmental disruption that followed these children straight into maturity. The potential outcomes of this widespread childhood instability did not stay confined to the 1970s. As the first major generation of children of divorce grew up, they carried these deeply internalized domestic fractures directly into their own adult relational lives. Sociological data tracking these individuals into the late 20th century and beyond revealed distinct historical trends regarding how they approached commitment. Having witnessed the sudden, legally facilitated collapse of their parents' seemingly permanent unions, this generation developed an acute, systemic skepticism toward the stability of all human relationships. They experienced heightened levels of relationship anxiety, a pervasive fear of abandonment, and a profound reluctance to enter into the legal contract of marriage themselves. This psychological inheritance directly fueled the modern trends of prolonged cohabitation, delayed marriage, and the rise of hyper-individualism in contemporary dating culture, as adult children of divorce desperately sought to construct emotional firewalls to protect themselves from replicating the trauma of their youth. This compounding crisis of childhood distress, parental alienation, and school system alienation eventually triggered the realization that the traditional legal framework was broken. The system had to move away from viewing children as property to be awarded to a single parent, and instead begin viewing them as independent human beings who possessed a fundamental right to the continuous, active involvement of both parents. This realization would eventually lay the groundwork for the emergence of joint custody legislation, mandatory parental education classes, and mediation services designed to remove child welfare from the adversarial combat of the courtroom. But long before those stabilizing legal reforms could be conceptualized or implemented, the immediate widespread destabilization of the American family unit triggered an immense, powerful reaction from the cultural baseline of the country. The rapid normalization of divorce, the financial ruin of single mothers, the psychological fracturing of millions of children, and the glamorization of the single lifestyle by the media machine did not occur without a fight. Below the surface of this changing society, a massive, highly organized counter-revolutionary movement was quietly gathering an explosive amount of political and social energy. Traditionalist forces, religious organizations, and conservative ideologues looked at the ruins of the mid-century nuclear family and decided that the survival of the United States depended on launching a total, uncompromising war to restore the traditional family structure. In our next segment, we will shift our analysis from the private trauma of the household to the public battlegrounds of the American political arena. We will examine the rise of the pro-family movement, the emergence of highly influential political coalitions, and the intense cultural backlash that sought to roll back the legislative victories of the no-fault revolution. Stay tuned for Part 8, where the counter-revolution begins. The shockwaves of the California Family Law Act and its rapid replication across other states triggered a profound sense of moral panic among traditionalist organizations and conservative political leaders throughout the United States. As historical trends revealed a vertical spike in marital dissolutions, conservative commentators and religious institutions argued that the legal system was actively subsidizing the destruction of the nation's foundational building block. The nuclear family, once celebrated as an impregnable fortress against global instability, was suddenly viewed by traditionalists as an endangered species under direct institutional assault. This panic was not merely a passive dissatisfaction. It rapidly transformed into a highly coordinated, well-funded political counteroffensive that sought to reinstitutionalize the permanence of marriage and roll back the legislative victories of the progressive reformers. Imagine if we look back from the perspective of 2026 at a Midwestern community in the year 1974, such as a suburban neighborhood just outside Cincinnati, Ohio. Consider a citizen named Donald Albright, a traditional church leader and local business owner. Donald watches as 3 families on his immediate block dissolve within a single calendar year under newly relaxed state statutes. For Donald and millions of Americans like him, this trend is not a triumph of individual liberation or a progressive step forward. It is a visible, terrifying unraveling of local social cohesion. He observes single-parent households struggling to maintain property values, children experiencing visible emotional and academic distress, and the traditional Sunday church pews growing increasingly empty of unified family units. This immediate, lived experience drives Donald to join local chapters of newly forming national organizations dedicated to preserving the traditional household, shifting his personal anxieties into an active, aggressive political crusade. This grassroots anxiety provided the raw fuel for the emergence of powerful political coalitions that would come to define the American culture wars for the subsequent decades. Religious organizations, most notably the National Conference of Catholic Bishops alongside rapidly mobilizing evangelical groups, began issuing formal theological and sociological indictments against no-fault legislation. They argued that by removing the concepts of justice, fault, and punishment from the courtroom, the state was violating the divine sanctity of the marriage covenant and reducing a sacred lifelong vow to a casual, disposable contract. These groups established sophisticated lobbying networks in state capitals, systematically testifying at legislative hearings to block the passage of no-fault bills in states that had not yet adopted them. Their legal strategy shifted from defending the old system to predicting catastrophic social outcomes, arguing that the total elimination of fault would lead to an epidemic of casual abandonment, fatherless households, and a massive expansion of the state welfare apparatus to support fractured families. This counter-revolutionary movement found its potent, strategic consolidation in the battle against the Equal Rights Amendment during the mid-1970s. Activists like Phyllis Schlafly and her highly organized Eagle Forum explicitly weaponized the societal fallout of the divorce revolution to defeat the amendment. Schlafly's case studies and speeches did not focus abstractly on constitutional law. Instead, they targeted the real, visible anxieties of suburban housewives who felt threatened by the changing legal landscape. Schlafly argued that the combination of no-fault divorce laws and the proposed Equal Rights Amendment would completely strip women of their historical legal protections. She pointed directly to the early potential outcomes of the California experiment, showing how the sudden shift to gender-blind asset division and the elimination of permanent alimony were plunging lifelong homemakers into immediate financial ruin. By linking the threat of divorce with the feminist movement, the counter-revolution successfully mobilized millions of conservative women who felt that their investments as homemakers were being systematically devalued by progressive legal reformers. In state legislatures across the American South and Midwest, this political mobilization resulted in a fierce, prolonged trench war over the rewriting of domestic relations statutes. While states like New York and California had collapsed quickly into the no-fault camp, more conservative jurisdictions put up an immense resistance. Legislators in states like Texas, Illinois, and Georgia introduced a series of defensive amendments designed to slow down the dissolution process. They successfully implemented mandatory cooling-off periods, requiring couples to remain physically separated for up to 2 full years before a no-fault petition could be finalized. They passed statutes forcing couples to undergo state-funded marriage counseling sessions or reconciliation assessments as a mandatory prerequisite for entering a divorce court. These legislative mechanisms were designed to reimpose friction onto the system, operating on the belief that if the state made the exit pathway sufficiently slow, expensive, and bureaucratic, couples would naturally abandon the process and reconcile. This legislative gridlock was heavily supported by an emerging cadre of conservative academics, sociologists, and think tanks that began publishing alternative datasets to counter the progressive narrative of personal growth and self-actualization. These institutions argued that the psychological and economic case studies of the early 1970s proved that the rapid normalization of divorce was creating a systemic crisis of child development and civic stability. They presented extensive data linking the rise of single-parent households with concurrent increases in juvenile crime rates, school dropouts, and long-term reliance on public assistance. The debate shifted from a question of individual adult happiness to a macroeconomic calculation of societal cost. The counter-revolution argued that the state had a compelling financial interest in protecting the intact nuclear family, because the alternative was a massive, unsustainable expansion of government spending on social safety nets, foster care, and law enforcement. To understand the absolute intensity of this confrontation, we must look at how the battle lines extended into local communities through school boards, library censorship campaigns, and local zoning ordinances. Conservative groups recognized that to stop the normalization of divorce, they had to control the cultural inputs that children were receiving. They launched aggressive campaigns to remove textbooks, literature, and educational curricula from public schools that depicted single-parent or blended families in a positive light, demanding a return to educational materials that exclusively reinforced the traditional nuclear model. Local zoning boards were pressured to pass restrictive ordinances defining a family strictly by blood or marriage, effectively preventing divorced parents from establishing non-traditional co-living arrangements or shared households within specific residential neighborhoods. The counter-revolution sought to construct a total cultural, educational, and legal environment that would contain the spread of the divorce revolution and reinforce the mid-century domestic norm. Despite the immense political energy, sophisticated funding, and genuine grassroots panic that fueled this counteroffensive, historical trends proved completely irreversible. The economic realities of the 1970s, characterized by high inflation and the structural necessity of dual-income households, continued to fracture the traditional division of labor that had underpinned the 1950s family model. Women could not be uneducated or forced out of the expanding labor market, and ordinary citizens refused to surrender the newly acquired right to exit toxic or dead relationships. The counter-revolution succeeded in slowing down the legislative adoption of no-fault laws in specific regions and creating lasting political coalitions that would dominate American political discourse for generations, but it ultimately failed to force the American family back into its mid-century mold. The old architecture was gone forever, leaving a society that had to learn how to live amid the permanent reality of mass marital dissolution. This realization forced an epic, pragmatic shift away from political warfare and toward systemic adaptation. As the 1970s progressed, the United States had to move beyond the binary battle of preservation versus destruction to invent a brand new social reality. In our next segment, we will analyze the complex, fascinating emergence of the modern blended family architecture. We will examine how an entire culture began to construct new psychological frameworks, language, and legal definitions to govern the uncharted territory of step-parenting, co-parenting across separate households, and joint custody agreements. We will look at how ordinary citizens built a new version of stability from the fragments of the old system, transforming the American family from a rigid, monolithic structure into a flexible, highly complex network of relationships. Stay tuned for Part 9, where we analyze the blueprint of the modern blended family and the rise of the co-parenting era. The blueprint of the modern blended family did not emerge as a planned sociological development. It was assembled out of sheer necessity from the fragments of millions of dissolved nuclear households. By the middle of the 1970s, the American public was forced to confront a striking demographic reality. Divorce was no longer a terminal destination where an individual remained permanently single or socially isolated. Instead, historical trends demonstrated that the vast majority of divorced individuals chose to re-enter the matrimonial market within 5 years of finalizing their legal dissolutions. This massive wave of remarriage created an entirely new, structurally complex domestic unit that the United States had never seen on a mainstream scale. Society had to abruptly transition from a binary understanding of family, where a household was either intact or broken, into an era of the extended multi-tiered relational network. To analyze the precise mechanics of this structural assembly, let us construct a detailed scenario involving an ordinary American citizen named Arthur Pendleton in the year 1975. Arthur had finalized his no-fault divorce from his first wife, Barbara, 2 years prior in 1973. Under the standard judicial practices of the era, Barbara was awarded primary physical custody of their 2 young children, while Arthur was granted bi-weekly visitation rights and ordered to pay monthly child support. In 1975, Arthur marries Eleanor Vance, a divorced woman who holds primary custody of her own 9-year-old daughter from a previous marriage. Overnight, the domestic architecture of Arthur and Eleanor's new household requires the integration of separate family histories, distinct parenting philosophies, competing financial obligations, and entirely unmapped legal relationships. Let us trace the step-by-step logistical and legal friction points that Arthur and Eleanor must navigate to maintain this new blended structure. The first major hurdle is the management of dual households and coordinate scheduling. Every alternating Friday afternoon, Arthur must drive across the city to pick up his biological children from his ex-wife Barbara's home. At the exact same time, Eleanor's ex-husband arrives at Arthur and Eleanor's new residence to pick up his daughter for his own court-mandated visitation weekend. This means that on any given weekend, Arthur and Eleanor's home shifts violently from a bustling household containing 3 children to a completely empty space, and then back again. This constant physical transit requires a high level of logistical synchronization that mid-century American culture had never prepared its citizens to manage. Furthermore, this dual household reality introduced profound psychological adjustments for the children involved. Arthur's biological children must adapt to having 2 entirely different sets of domestic rules, behavioral expectations, and physical environments. In their mother's house, they operate under one structure. In their father and stepmother's house, they must adapt to an entirely different matrix of boundaries. They must learn to share their bedrooms, toys, and their father's limited emotional attention with a stepsister whom they barely know. This constant adaptation frequently triggered intense boundary confusion, sibling rivalry, and loyalty conflicts, as children struggled to understand where they truly belonged within these interlocking family trees. While families scrambled to adapt logistically, the American legal system found itself completely paralyzed by the lack of statutory frameworks governing step relationships. In 1975, Arthur possessed 0 formal legal rights or responsibilities regarding his new stepdaughter, despite providing her with daily shelter, food, and emotional guidance. If Eleanor's daughter suffered a medical emergency while Eleanor was away at work, Arthur lacked the legal authority to sign admission papers or consent to emergency surgical procedures at a local hospital. Insurance corporations routinely refused to allow stepchildren to be added to a stepfather's employer-sponsored health insurance policy, unless a formal, expensive, and legally complex adoption process was finalized. This forced blended families into a state of continuous legal vulnerability, operating as a functional unit in daily life while being treated as complete strangers by the institutional architecture of the state. This institutional vacuum was equally severe within the public educational system. When Arthur attempted to attend a parent-teacher conference or review the academic report cards of his stepdaughter, school administrations routinely denied him access, citing strict privacy regulations that only recognized biological parents or legal guardians. Schools were forced to completely redesign their administrative pipelines, inventing new dual notification systems so that report cards, field trip consent forms, and disciplinary notices could be distributed simultaneously to separate households. The classic nuclear-centric school calendar, which assumed a single mother and father attending a single open house event, had to be systematically dismantled to prevent intense, public confrontations between biological parents and their new spouses in front of the student body. This logistical and institutional strain directly accelerated the emergence of a revolutionary legal concept that would permanently transform family law: joint custody. Up until the mid-1970s, judges almost universally favored the winner-take-all model, awarding sole custody to one parent and reducing the other to a distant visitor. But as blended families multiplied, family law pioneers realized that completely severing a child's connection to a biological parent to integrate them into a new stepfamily was causing widespread psychological damage. Case studies from progressive family courts began to demonstrate that children experience far better developmental outcomes when both biological parents retained equal legal authority to make decisions regarding education, healthcare, and religious upbringing, regardless of which physical house the child slept in on a Tuesday night. This realization led to the introduction of joint legal custody statutes, which forced ex-spouses to cooperate as co-parents across separate geographic locations. The rise of the co-parenting era shifted the definition of divorce itself. It was no longer viewed as the absolute termination of a relationship, but rather as a forced reorganization of a permanent partnership. Arthur and his ex-wife Barbara could no longer simply walk away from each other. They were legally bound to continuously negotiate child-rearing strategies, extracurricular expenses, and holiday schedules for the remainder of their children's minority. This requirement for ongoing communication created a massive demand for alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, driving the rapid growth of specialized family mediation services, court-ordered parenting classes, and family therapy practices designed to teach highly antagonistic adults how to separate their past marital grievances from their current co-parenting duties. Financially, the blended family operated as an incredibly complex, high-stakes matrix of resource redistribution. Arthur's household income did not belong exclusively to his current family unit. A substantial percentage of his monthly earnings was automatically transferred out of his household via child support checks to his ex-wife Barbara. Simultaneously, Eleanor's household relied on incoming child support checks from her ex-husband to offset the daily living expenses of her daughter. If one ex-spouse experienced job loss, health crises, or simply refused to comply with court orders, the entire financial equilibrium of the new blended household collapsed instantly. This economic interdependence meant that the financial security of Arthur and Eleanor's marriage was permanently tied to the economic behaviors, career stability, and choices of two external individuals over whom they possessed zero direct control. As the 1970s drew to a close, this complex web of blended families, co-parenting agreements, and joint custody schedules became the dominant structural reality for millions of American citizens. The monolithic, rigid family model of the mid-century had been decisively replaced by a fluid, highly adaptive, and thoroughly decentralized network of relations. This was the ultimate institutional synthesis of the divorce revolution. Society had dismantled the old structure to escape its suffocating confines, ignored the economic and psychological chaos of the immediate fallout, and was now actively building a brand new social contract out of the wreckage. In our 10th and final segment, we will bring this entire decade-long masterclass to its ultimate conclusion by analyzing the permanent legacy of this cultural transformation. From our vantage point, we will examine how the radical experiments of the 1960s and 1970s directly constructed the relational anxieties, the legal realities, and the fluid definitions of commitment that govern contemporary American life. We will synthesize the raw data, evaluate the multi-generational outcomes, and provide the definitive answer to how the collapse of the 1960s marriage contract rewrote the psychological DNA of the United States. Stay tuned for Part 10, the final masterclass synthesis. The final synthesis of this journey requires us to realize that the 1960s did not simply reform the institution of marriage. It entirely replaced one foundational philosophy of human alignment with another. It engineered a total transition from the institutional marriage model to the expressive companionate marriage model, a structural flip that transformed marriage from a lifelong societal obligation into a conditional arrangement based entirely on ongoing personal fulfillment. We stand today in the year 2026, looking at a landscape of human relationships that would be completely unrecognizable to the generation that birthed the mid-century nuclear family. The true legacy of that turbulent decade is not found merely in the dusty archives of legislative chambers or the shifting statistics of old census bureaus. It is woven directly into the psychological fabric of how modern Americans love, commit, fear, and define the very boundaries of their personal identities. Imagine a contemporary American scenario in the current year 2026 involving a 32-year-old corporate consultant named Chloe Miller. Chloe is currently navigating a highly successful career, possesses an independent bank account, holds multiple premium credit cards, and has been cohabiting with her partner in an urban apartment for 4 years. They are considering marriage, but before any date is set, Chloe insists on drafting a comprehensive prenuptial agreement that clearly demarcates her assets, protects her corporate retirement accounts, and outlines an equitable exit strategy in the event of a future dissolution. For Chloe, this action is not an expression of cynicism or a lack of romance. It is treated as standard, rational due diligence. What Chloe does not consciously realize is that her behavioral patterns, her deep systemic requirement for financial autonomy, and her strategic approach to marital contracts are the direct evolutionary descendants of the trauma her grandmother experienced in 1971. Her entire framework of intimacy has been psychologically hardwired by the historic shifts we have analyzed across this masterclass series. By evaluating historical trends up to 2026, we see that the primary potential outcome of the 1960s revolution was the birth of what sociologists term expressive individualism. Under the old pre-1960s framework, the success of an individual life was measured by how effectively a person conformed to institutional roles. You were judged by how well you performed as a provider husband or a nurturing housewife. Personal happiness was viewed as a secondary, luxury byproduct of a stable household, never as the primary objective. But the cultural explosions of the mid-1960s completely inverted this hierarchy. The individual's right to self-actualization, emotional growth, and psychological authenticity became the supreme moral imperative of American society. Marriage was abruptly forced to justify its continuous existence based on its ability to foster the individual development of both partners. If a marriage stopped serving that psychological purpose, staying in the relationship was no longer viewed as an honorable sacrifice. It was reframed as an act of bad faith and a waste of one's limited lifespan. This prioritization of individual authenticity over institutional permanence directly drove the complete modernization of the American legal apparatus. The chaotic, experimental no-fault statute signed by Ronald Reagan in California quickly evolved into a highly institutionalized family law ecosystem that governs the contemporary United States. We see this manifested in case studies of modern collaborative divorce, mandatory mediation pipelines, and the ubiquitous nature of prenuptial agreements. The legal system stopped pretending that it could or should enforce marital longevity through state coercion. Instead, family courts in 2026 function essentially as administrative liquidation managers, focusing entirely on the technical, emotionless division of assets and the mathematical calculation of child support matrices. The moral component of the marital contract has been completely purged from the judicial system, leaving a streamlined bureaucratic process that treats the ending of a family unit with the exact same procedural detachment as the dissolution of a business partnership. This structural detachment has had profound, multi-generational consequences on the psychological DNA of successive American generations. The children of the 1960s and 1970s divorce boom grew up to become the parents of today, transmitting an inherent systemic caution regarding commitment down the generational line. Historical trends show that this caution has manifested in a dramatic, unprecedented delay in the age of first marriage across the United States. In 1960, the median age for first marriage was 20 for women and 23 for men. By 2026, those numbers have climbed to historic highs, with adults routinely waiting until their late 20s or early 30s to legally bind themselves to a partner, or opting to completely bypass the legal institution of marriage altogether in favor of long-term cohabitation and domestic partnerships. The fear of experiencing the catastrophic financial and psychological vulnerabilities that plagued their ancestors has created a culture of hypervigilance, where emotional intimacy is continuously weighed against the necessity of maintaining personal safety nets and independent escape routes. Furthermore, this cultural normalization of individual fulfillment has triggered a striking phenomenon known as gray divorce. Case studies from recent years show that while the divorce rate among younger demographics has stabilized or even declined due to delayed marriage and increased caution, the rate among Americans over the age of 50 has experienced a dramatic expansion. This trend proves that the expressive individualist ideology engineered in the 1960s does not possess an expiration date. Older Americans, having raised their children and reached the twilight of their careers, look at their remaining decades and refuse to tolerate empty, incompatible partnerships. They are actively utilizing the legal mechanisms forged 60 years ago to seek personal reinvention late in life, proving that the demand for authenticity continues to override the traditional value of marital endurance across the entire lifespan. When we assemble all 10 pieces of this analytical puzzle, we arrive at the definitive conclusion of our masterclass. The shifting divorce journey of the 1960s was not a localized legal adjustment or a brief period of social deviance. It was a total, irreversible rewrite of the American social contract. It permanently altered the power dynamics of the household by providing women with the economic and legal paths to autonomy. It forced the media machine to monetize and normalize the realities of fractured families, transforming the cultural baseline of the country. It stress-tested the educational and psychological fields, eventually giving birth to modern co-parenting frameworks and joint custody models. Most importantly, it fundamentally detached the concepts of love and commitment from the mandate of lifelong legal permanence. We now live in the world that the pioneers of the 1960s built out of the ruins of the mid-century suburban dream. Every conversation we have today around relationship boundaries, dating apps, prenup negotiations, and the pursuit of single happiness is spoken in the cultural language that was invented during that revolutionary decade. But as we settle into the permanent reality of this individualist landscape, a brand new, equally volatile crisis is quietly beginning to fracture the foundations of 2026 society. The complete dismantling of the traditional family model has solved the problem of individual confinement, but it has accidentally birthed an epidemic of profound social isolation, declining birth rates, and an institutional collapse of community support systems that no one anticipated. This brings us to the next great historical frontier that we must explore. How did a society that successfully liberated the individual from the cages of the past suddenly find itself trapped in an existential battle against an unprecedented wave of systemic loneliness? How did the economic engines of modern America capitalize on this hyper-independence to transform isolation into a highly lucrative corporate commodity? The answers to these questions lie in the dark, uncharted territory of the 1980s corporate takeover of the American lifestyle, where the liberated individuals of the 70s were systematically funneled into a brand new type of economic confinement. In our next major multi-part documentary series, we will dive deep into the secret history of the consumerist architecture that replaced the traditional community, analyzing the precise mechanisms that turned personal freedom into collective isolation. The battle for the American soul was far from over. It was merely entering a highly sophisticated technological phase.